Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 7. In this chapter we're talking about creating Republican governments. Now that's Republican with the lowercase r, okay? So Republican as in of a republic. We're not talking about Republican as in the political party. It's important to keep those two things separate. So we're talking about creating a republic, and there are some important people who kind of advocated for that. Thomas Paine was one of those important people who advocated for a republic. Now, a republic is simply a state without a king, okay? So these people, these founding fathers, and the people who preceded them, you know, the people who advocated for this new government, for what will become the United States, knew that they didn't want a king again. And we know why they didn't want a king. You know, they felt that they had been oppressed by the King of England. So they didn't want a king. That's really all they knew. They didn't have a plan for what they did want, but they just didn't want a king. Thomas Paine made this idea of a republic popular through publishing. You know, you've heard the saying, the pen is mightier than the sword. Thomas Paine used that. He used his writing in order to affect public opinion. And the brochure, if you want to call it that, the newsletter that he published was this essay called Common Sense. And it sounded more like a sermon than a political speech. It was first published in 1776 in January. I'm including a link here from the Gutenberg files for Thomas Paine's works. This particular section is called Of Monarchy and Hereditary Succession. And you can read that Thomas Paine link at your convenience. Also important, Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence affirmed the break with England, and it did not suggest what would replace the idea of monarchy. I mean, keep in mind, this is all these people had ever known. They were English. They had been under English rule, which was a monarchy. So they didn't really know what to replace it with. The republics at this time were very few and far between. There was Genoa, Venice, the Dutch Republic, but very few. I mean, so people really didn't have a lot of experience with this notion of a republic. And you also had these Enlightenment thinkers, you know, because we're at about the time, right? So the Enlightenment is engrossing culture, and the European Enlightenment thinkers are really kind of scratching their heads. You know, could a republic work? Is something like that even stable? Because monarchies had been in place for so very long. So monarchy rests on the practice of a dynastic succession, which basically just means that it's passed down through the family. So one monarch's child or relative would inherit the throne. Democracy rests on the majority. Now, keep in mind, these people at this particular time in history were really big in our country on talking about democracy and what it means to us. Well, you know, technically, we really don't have a literal democracy. Democracy rests on majority rule. If majority had ruled, we would have had a different president in the last election. Majority does not rule here. We have a different process in place. Now, we do have a degree of majority rule, right? So we can elect our local officials and the people who represent us in Congress, you know, in the House and in the Senate, and that's decided by majority rule of all the voters. But remember, at this time too, we really haven't started voting yet. We haven't secured that kind of system. You know, who knows at this point what it's going to be. So in terms of a republic, power rests with the people through their elected representatives, which is what the United States has. So don't confuse America's idea and ideals about democracy to confuse the fact that we are actually set up as a republic. So the problems with democracy, wealthy landowners, merchants, and planters thought that democracy was not a good replacement for monarchy because not everyone was smart enough to vote. Okay, keep that in mind. So we had basically bourgeoisie people who felt like they were a little smarter than some others, and that they didn't want, I don't know, they didn't want the piddly little subsistence farmer down the road making political decisions that would impact them and their wealth. So conservative Whigs then, the political party Whigs, defined themselves in opposition to democracy, and they kind of equated it with anarchy because it was this disorder. When you have everyone making a decision for everyone, it just seemed chaotic to them. And the Federalist Papers were written actually by a number of different people and promoted the idea that majority rule can overpower minority rights, and that the wealthy few had reason to fear that a hostile and envious majority could seize and redistribute their wealth. So why was that important? Well, because look what they'd just come from, right? So they had this monarchy in England that was taxing them. They were controlling how they could import and export. So, they'd already had their money jacked around by somebody else. They didn't want that to happen this way. So the Federalist Papers really promoted that this idea could be really dangerous to the wealthy. So within the Whigs, we had two different kinds of Whigs, okay? We had conservative Whigs and radical Whigs. Now, we're not necessarily talking radical as in violence and all that kind of stuff. We're talking about radical thinking, okay? So conservative Whigs believed in a government by a patrician class. And if you've had the civilization classes, you know that the patrician class was kind of the noble ruling class. So the Whigs believed in government by this more wealthy, this more noble class of a small group of privileged people. The radical Whigs thought that maybe that should broaden out a little, and they pushed more for democracy. So something else that the Founding Fathers are taking into consideration is Plato's idea of the just state. Just as in justice, the just state. And Plato said that to have ethical citizens, we must create an ethical society. So it sounds pretty simple and kind of confusing at the same time. So let me just lay it out for you. If you want to have good people, you have to create a good society. Boom, there it is. So that's why today we have so many towns that are looking to improve towns. They want to build better bridges. They want to have really good schools. They want to have a water park, some sort of attraction, the lake, the river, whatever it is, to draw people to that area. Because when you have those great attractions, you draw good people to those attractions. It's the idea. So to have ethical citizens, you have to create an ethical society. It's the same principle. To get good people, you have to provide good things for those people. Good draws good. Okay, birds of a feather flock together. All of those little things kind of sum this up. To have ethical citizens, you have to have that ethical society. So the Republic requires its citizens to cultivate virtuous behavior. So if the people are virtuous, the Republic will survive. If the people become corrupt, the Republic will fall. Whether republicanism, lowercase r, succeeded or failed in the United States would depend on civic virtue and an educated citizenry. So in setting these Republican rules, again, lowercase r, the Founding Fathers argued that property holders had the greatest stake in society and therefore should be the ones trusted to make decisions for it. Now, this is a form of elitism, okay? Only the elite could vote. The elite had a voice. And it stayed that way for many, many years. And some would argue that we're still struggling with that today. But that's a basic idea for setting these rules early on. The aristocratic side of republicanism and the belief that the true custodians of public virtue were those who had served in the military also came about as an idea. The Society of the Cincinnati was formed, and membership in that was passed down to the oldest son in each family, just like a throne. It was almost like a monarchy to be part of this organization called the Society of Cincinnati. And it was, the idea that those who were truly virtuous would pass down that honor to the oldest son in the family, very patriarchal, and would continue passing that down. So all of this sets into motion some revolutionary changes. One is coverture, which is the legal status of women. A married woman had no legal or economic status separate from that of her husband or her father if she was not yet married. She could not conduct business or buy or sell property on her own at this time. Her husband controlled any property that she brought into the marriage, although he could not sell it without her agreement. So at least that was something, right? So if, say, a woman is the only child of a family and she inherits the family property and then marries the husband, then is the controller of that property. This is before prenups, right? Anyway, married women's status did not change as a result of the revolution, and wives remained economically dependent on their husbands. However, the spirit of this revolution gave women cause to discuss their rights more. So while the Revolutionary War really didn't change anything for women, it did kind of spark the idea of change and the idea of, hey, look, we're talking about a nation and we're developing the nation's rights. What about our rights? So this is John Adams and his wife Abigail, whom he often referred to as Portia. Anyway, John Adams was our second president and was involved in writing what's going to become our Constitution. Abigail was a voracious letter writer, and she wrote to him often while he was gone in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. And she wrote to him and, kind of sent him a note, hey, don't forget about women's rights too. And he's like, hey, I deal with that enough at home, and blew it off, right? So anyway, all paraphrased there, by the way, but I thought that was kind of a neat story. Now, when he actually takes office as president, she was the first lady to actually live in the White House. She used to hang her laundry up in there to dry. I think it was in the East Room that was still under construction at the time. Other people who were important, other women who were important, one of these was Judith Murray. She argued that a woman's education should be extensive enough to allow her to maintain herself and her family if need be, if there was no male breadwinner. So she's not saying, by golly, I want a chance to earn my own income, I want a career, I want all that stuff. She's saying, I want to be able to take care of myself and my family if my husband is injured and can't. Because remember, at this point in history, there's no disability to sign up for if you get hurt in a farming accident. There's no unemployment if your crop doesn't come in or if you lose a job. So women would have to many times take jobs in order to provide for the family. So she just wanted to be educated enough to do that. She was able to make enough money from her own publications, and the idea that she could do this was really radical, but still traditional at the same time, right? Because she just really wanted the same thing. She just wanted the opportunity to provide for her family if needed. She also believed that women were much better at raising children and maintaining the morality and virtue of the family than men were. So she was very much a traditionalist in that way. She felt like a woman's place, her woman's rightful place was in the home, doing those chores, doing the child rearing and the housework and maintaining family values. Slavery offered the most glaring contradiction between the idea of equality that was stated in the Declaration of Independence and what was actually happening real time. Thomas Jefferson owned more than 100 slaves, of whom he freed only a few during his lifetime or in his will. He thought that blacks were inferior to whites. He urged the end of slavery in Virginia and also urged sending slaves away. However, Southern plantation owners disagreed with that because, basically Jefferson was shipping away their free labor. There was a system in place in which slaves could be released, could be freed. It was called manumission. It was the legal way a slave owner could release his slaves from bondage. And there were about 10,000 slaves freed in Virginia. In Philadelphia, 1775, Dr. Benjamin Rush and other Philadelphia Quakers formed the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So as early as 1775, people are talking about getting rid of slavery in the United States. Wealthy New Yorkers formed the New York Manumission Society in 1785, which, as we know, manumission was this legal process of releasing slaves. This society worked to educate black children and devoted funds to protect free blacks from being kidnapped. Because think about that, these people are kidnapped and sold into slavery. There's nothing to stop other people from kidnapping them right here, in the United States and selling them back into slavery. So that was a big deal. They had to have protection from that. The Massachusetts Constitution in 1780 technically freed all slaves, but hundreds still remained enslaved in that state. Basically because, what else are you going to do? And maybe they could only be freed if the owner told them they were. And if you had been captive for so long in slavery, would you want to chance it? Hey, I heard that we're free now, I'm going to take on off. No, of course not. It's really dangerous. So just because the Constitution said they were free didn't mean that these slaves in Massachusetts were actually free. Also, in the 1780s in Massachusetts, a series of court decisions undermined slavery when several slaves, citing assault by their masters, were actually successfully able to get their freedom in court. 1,100 slaves continued to be held in the New England states in 1800. So, we typically think of slavery very much connected to the South, but it wasn't just the South. There were 36,000 slaves that remained in the North, with the highest concentrations in New Jersey and New York. New York only gradually phased out slavery, with the last slaves emancipated in the late 1820s. The Revolution brought changes in religion to the U.S. as well. The established church had been the Church of England, which did not tolerate Catholics, Baptists, or followers of other religions. In 1786, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom ended the Church of England's hold and allowed religious liberty. No one could be forced to attend or support a specific church or be prosecuted for his or her beliefs. Pennsylvania's original constitution limited office holders in the state legislature to those who professed belief in both the Old and the New Testaments. So that's going to omit some people, right? The religious test prohibited Jews from holding office in that state, and because the New Testament's not part of Jewish religion. In 1790, Pennsylvania removed that Old Testament, New Testament qualification from its constitution. So John Adams urged the 13 independent colonies, which are going to very soon become states, to write their own state constitutions. And Enlightenment political thought really influenced Adams. Montesquieu was the one who pushed the separation of powers in government. And so that seemed like a good idea, right? If you have a separation of powers, then one person, like a monarch, can't have too much control of one thing. Adams suggested a system of checks and balances in which three separate branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, would maintain the balance of power. Now, the legislature, he suggested, would be bicameral. That means two houses. And that's what we have, right? The House and the Senate. And in doing so, that would even add to that balance of power. He proposed that each state remain sovereign as its own republic, and some states actually chose to be more democratic than others. The first step in developing this new nation was actually to create the Articles of Confederation. And these were really difficult to people really identified as colonies, not as a united nation. And if you've studied Western civilization at all, you know that that was the same problem that the Greeks had at one point, you know, because all of the Greek societies identified as their own cultures and they didn't unify, you know. So same thing's happening in the early stages of the United States. This actually created a league of leadership among the new states. The Articles of Confederation were not approved until 1781. It was really hard for everyone to get on that whole national mentality kind of thing. And the Articles of Confederation set a unicameral legislature. So one house, like in the Continental Congress. It took 9 states for any measure to pass, and amendments required all states a unanimous vote. Also, the Articles of Confederation gave Congress absolutely no taxing power. Now, none of us like taxes, right? I mean, we pay them because we have to. None of us really love taxes. But honestly, what would we have if we didn't pay taxes? That's the situation that the Articles of Confederation put the early United States in. There's no money coming in. So the Articles of Confederation also delve into land ordinances to establish rules for westward settlement of public domain lands. I think I mentioned early on that from the very beginning, from the first time people set foot on the eastern coast of the United States, we've been moving westward. There are actually 4 westward movements. So we'll talk a little more about that as we start talking about the Old West. So just know that the U.S. has been moving west for a long time, until we got to the coast. It was important for them to establish this westward settlement idea because, you know, they wanted more land already. They established rules for admission for new states. They developed the idea that land sales would raise money for government. Now, keeping in mind, they don't really own this land, right? I mean, they don't even really know what they got west, but they're thinking that selling that land will raise all the money they need for government. And Ordinance of 1784 by Thomas Jefferson said that new states would have equal standing as the first states. So those first 13 colonies that become the first 13 states, they're not going to have any extra pull or any extra weight because they were the originals. You know, Jefferson said that all new states admitted to the Union from this westward expansion should have an equal voice. The Ordinance of 1785 divided land into rectangles to prepare for sale. These were 6 square mile pieces of land. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 would split the territory into 3 to 5 states, which would end up being Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And they'd be eligible for statehood when population reached 60,000 and then slavery was banned north of the Ohio River. Now, while all of this is going on, we have some other problems going on as well. Shays Rebellion was one of those. It lasted 18 months. What happened was there were these Massachusetts farmers who were facing high debt and taxes plus foreclosure. Many of these people were war veterans who had asked for help. You know, they were war veterans who felt like they should be getting a little more for their service than they had. So in this, one of these was Captain Daniel Shays, and because he had been a captain in the war, we're talking Revolutionary War, he was kind of singled out as the ringleader of this cause, although technically he wasn't, but he did join in. Citizens took up arms and closed courthouses across the state as their foreclosed property was about to be auctioned. So the farmers wanted their debts forgiven. They demanded the state constitution be revised in order to give them some sort of consideration for their service in the war and for their importance as farmers. The government retaliated against these rebels with deadly force. They did offer a pardon for a Pledge of Allegiance, but the rebellion grew. So nobody really liked that. It was a private army of 400 that finally came in and stopped the rebellion. And this whole incident convinced George Washington to come out of retirement to get involved again to help put down this rebellion. So by 1787, the Founding Fathers knew it was time to change those Articles of Confederation. Things weren't working out with them. So the 1787 Philadelphia Convention met to address that need. They decided very quickly to change the framework altogether, which became what we now have as the U.S. Constitution. Now, 55 men met in secret to draft this Constitution, and we know that because James Madison kept records of it. Rhode Island didn't send a delegate, and New Hampshire delegates got there late. Some worried that the convention had no authority to create a strong national government. That's what they were looking to do, create a stronger national government. So in terms of representation, they had to decide how representatives would be chosen and how much representation would each state have. James Madison suggested what is known as the Virginia Plan. In this, it would be a strong national government that could overturn state laws, bicameral legislature again, you know, the two houses. Citizens would elect members of the lower house, and then the state legislatures would pick members for the upper house based on the state's population. So basically what that says is we would elect members to the House of Representatives, but whoever served as our state legislatures in Little Rock would have picked members for the Senate. So also he suggested an executive branch of government and a judicial branch of government. And he also suggested that Virginia, as the most populous state, should have a bigger role and that slavery would be safe. You know, slavery would be safe there if, slavery would be safe throughout because Virginia was a slave state. So had Virginia had more control than any of the other states, slavery would have been able to continue safely. The Connecticut Compromise, which is also known as the Great Compromise, suggested the bicameral legislation with a Senate that had equal representation for all states, and the lower house would have proportional representation, which is what we have in the House and the Senate today. Also, as part of this compromise, each slave counted as 3/5 of a person toward representation, but couldn't vote. So we have these slaves, they're counting kind of, sort of as people at this point, but they still can't vote. And it also created an electoral college, which was a mechanism that would be used for choosing the president. Each state would have a certain number of electors, like senators and representatives would equal the number of delegates. Now, the critics of this plan said that it wasn't a direct election of the president, and that was something that, you know, they felt like they wanted. So, you know, throughout this, as we've talked about this early discussion about how we're going to form the United States, I've been very clear about, you know, lowercase r, not capital R, in Republican. So lowercase r as a republic, not as capital R as in Republican Party. And that's because we really didn't have a party system at this point. Now, what we do have developing are Federalist and Anti-Federalist. So federal, which as you know is national, like the national government. So Federalist supported the idea of a strong national government. Anti-Federalist did not. They were against it. They felt like the states should remain sovereign. So the Federalists supported the 1787 Constitution and wanted a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists argued that that Constitution very much weakened state sovereignty. And the vote to approve the Constitution was 30 to 27, which is pretty close. And we will talk more about that in the next chapter.